when you politicize the Department of Justice.
ICE is going to enforce the immigration law. There's nothing in the INA, the Immigration Nationality Act, says you got to be convicted of a serious crime in order to be removed from this country.
I was stunned at the scope of those pardons. We're talking about 1,500 people, some of them who engaged in violence, who will never be held accountable for their crimes.
Are the laws of our nation going to mean anything, or can they be taken away by the stroke of a pen?
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Pomp and pardons. They assaulted police officers and then tried to overturn an election after the Justice Department's four-year effort to arrest, prosecute, and punish those behind January 6th. President Trump grants clemency or pardons to roughly 1,500 people. Among those, released former Proud Boys leader Enrique Tarrio and Oath Keepers founder Stewart Rhodes. They were convicted of orchestrating plots to stop the peaceful transfer of power. Executive action overload. Roughly 200 executive actions have already been signed, from a national emergency at the border to redefining birthright citizenship to restoring federal policy recognizing just male and female as genders and renaming the Gulf of Mexico. What happens next and the legal challenges this flurry of executive actions have already faced in court. I want to start tonight with Ed O'Keefe, who is joining us from the North Lawn of the White House. Oh, and Scott McFarland. I was told moments ago Scott would not be available, but you know Scott is always available. Scott, good to see you on Capitol Hill. Talk to us about the pardons and the reactions you have gotten today at the Capitol.
There's a mix of outrage and resignation about these pardons. Democrats and the victims, the police victims and staffers from January 6th, say this is a gut punch and also raises the risk of future political violence because it took away the deterrence and the moral hazard. Republican senators, we talked to many of them today. Some said they were surprised, but defended the pardons, saying Trump promised this on the campaign trail, Major. What's more, they say Trump, at some point, has decided that January 6th should be in the past and that people should look to the future. You're going to hear all kinds of defenses of this from Republican senators, but I can tell you, having talked to a number of them, Major and Ed, they were caught flat-footed, that it was a blanket pardon and not case by case and not judicious.
And Scott, I also saw in some of the Senate's comments from Republicans, well, Biden abused the pardon powers, therefore Trump is justified pardoning as he sees fit.
I talked to a dozen Senate Republicans today. Every single one of them drew an equation between the Biden pardons of January 20th and the Trump pardons of January 20th. It is clearly a synchronized message, or just a message they're easily able to synchronize on, because this all happened in such a short window of time between the two things. I mean, the Democrats would argue there's an asymmetry there of violent insurrectionists versus protective pardons against those Trump has scorned, but the parallels are being made anyhow.
Ed O'Keefe, at the North Lawn of the White House, you talked to those who were close to President Biden in the waning hours of his presidency about these very family pardons. What did they tell you in defense of them?
Major, in the waning minutes, it was just 9 minutes to go in his presidency when we reached someone on the phone who explained to us that essentially, after hearing the threats of possible prosecution, or as they put it, prosecution or persecution of the Biden family during the campaign and the weeks since during the transition, the president felt compelled to do this and had made the decision to issue those pardons in the last few days just before he left office. Sources didn't know whether the president's siblings, James, Frank, and Valerie, all of whom have been involved in his political career at various points in official and sort of unofficial, just, brotherly advice kind of roles, asked for those pardons, or whether the president just did it on his own. But either way, it was quite striking that literally at the moment he was being introduced on stage in the rotunda yesterday, the White House, as it was packing up, the Biden White House sent out one final note about those pardons. I think January 20th, 2025 is going to go down in history as a really tough day for the American justice system to see two presidents do this, in essence trying to wipe the slate clean either preemptively or after the fact with things that are big parts of their legacy, or at least were big parts of the arguments against them from their other side and from their critics. And, to some extent, I think where Democrats are going to be frustrated is that, in essence, the outgoing president did, to some extent, at least present the talking point for Republicans that these are kind of now canceling each other out. and so maybe everyone should just move on. Plenty of people don't want to do that, don't believe that should happen, but the argument could be made now, because the former president did it, that perhaps they both have abused the pardon system, so game over, let's move on to the next thing.
Ed, remind the audience what, if anything, these particular family members within President Biden's inner circle might have reason to be afraid of, or the president might have been reason to be afraid of, in terms of investigation or possible prosecution.
So there's James, Valerie, and Frank. James had some questions about business work he had done alongside Hunter Biden at various times, and then some separate work he did for some healthcare entities in Pennsylvania. Had been subject to an investigation, no wrongdoing found, was also the subject of some congressional review as well at one time or another. But it was his work that was being investigated that allowed that Republican argument and label the Biden crime family to sort of develop, because well, it's not just Hunter, it's also his brother. And his sister Valerie, his brother Frank, at various times have either been in government or lobbying as well. Valerie is a pretty active and still engaged to some extent influence peddler, as many who are relatives of or close associates of well-known politicians become. Former staffers on the Hill head down to lobbying shops in downtown Washington, or in this case, the sibling of the offspring. For example, Susie Wiles, the new chief of staff, her daughter is working for a big Florida-based lobbying firm that just opened a D.C. shop to take advantage of the relationship. That's no different than what Valerie Biden, James Biden, and Frank Biden have done. Frank Biden was a Clinton administration official. Some questions about his personal life, but nothing that ever rose to congressional or criminal review. And again, it just, the fact that these pardons also go back to 2014 raised the question, what did they do in 2014? And I believe that's around the time there were some of the questions about what James Biden might have been up to. So again, just a striking, pretty galling move by the outgoing president, who of course did it similar to when he did the Hunter Biden pardon, in a way where he won't get asked about it, or there won't be an opportunity to ask him about it for quite some time, if anyone even remembers to ask him whenever they get around to interviewing him, which of course is such a rare thing.
Scott McFarland, back to you on Capitol Hill. Was there any sentiment expressed by senators today that the pardon powers, which you and I and anyone who pays attention to them often communicate, are basically unchecked where the president is concerned, that maybe Congress can or should do something to put some boundaries on the pardon power of a sitting president?
You have touched on the one issue that is bringing everybody together this day after Inauguration Day. I mean, first of all, you're talking about a power that Congress has no fingerprints on. They don't like that to begin with as a fundamental dynamic. But yeah, you just watched what I think Ed properly characterized as a day that will not go down in glory, January 20th, 2025, because of the pardons defining so much of the day, and to a degree, overshadowing a presidential inauguration, and an historic one at that. I think you'll find proposals that come out. If you can find a bipartisan nucleus to start, there'll be people who at least will informally indicate their support. But the complication there is, how do you get that past the finish line and not upset the sitting president, who is probably keen on using that pardon power a whole lot more over the next 4 years? It's an idea that has bipartisan spirit, but unless Ed and you see one, I don't, not a feasible road ahead for it.
Ed O'Keefe, back to you on the North Lawn of the White House. And some of the video that you've been seeing side by side with either Ed O'Keefe or Scott McFarland, some of the video you just saw with Scott was President Trump signing executive actions yesterday. Earlier, there was sidebar video of President Trump and J.D. Vance, the vice president, at a national prayer service at the National Cathedral. That was earlier today. Ed, on the question of immigration policy, a significant number of moves put into motion by President Trump last night.
Yeah, real quick, though, on the congressional thing, we were expecting to hear from the Speaker and the Majority Leader after they met with the President. The microphones were set up out here at the White House for them to take questions. We were called out to hear from them, and then suddenly we were told they're not coming out. Was that because they don't want to take questions on pardons? Was that because they don't want to take questions on some other matters regarding nominees that has come up this afternoon? Unclear, but there was an opportunity for them to potentially give a sense of where they'd like to go on that issue, and they took a pass. On immigration, you have seen today now several different entities in more than a dozen states essentially sue to start picking apart the immigration policy the president was putting in place with executive action. We're now seeing lawsuits challenging his decision to try to end birthright citizenship, which, let's remind the audience, is a constitutional right, something that was put in place by the founding fathers. He would like to end it. It will be challenged in court by all sorts of different entities and a handful of states saying it's unconstitutional. It puts a lot of different families at risk. You're also seeing today the Department of Homeland Security issue new guidance to its employees, making clear that one of its main objectives, if not the primary one, is to root out undocumented immigrants in this country, especially those that are a risk to public safety or national security, and get them out. And notably, they revoked a Biden-era rule that had stood for quite some time, even before that, that says so-called sensitive areas, churches, schools, hospitals, can be visited and entered by immigration agents if they believe somebody is being harbored in those locations. That decision will draw the ire not only of hospital companies and campuses and school districts, but also, frankly, the Catholic Church, which oversees all three types of sensitive areas: schools, churches, and hospitals. Cardinals across the country have signaled in recent weeks that they're concerned about possible changes. The announcement coming just a little while ago, likely to draw more specific ire from cardinals, including Cardinal Dolan of New York, who gave one of the benedictions yesterday at the inauguration. So it's a good reminder that while there were dozens of executive actions taken, hundreds, several of them, many of them, are going to result in legal action that delay their implementation if they ever get implemented. And several of them also don't take effect for quite some time. They were not immediate. For example, there's things in there about federal personnel that's going to require several months of review and then termination of employment potentially. Some of that can get challenged. Stepping out of the Paris Climate Accords of the World Health Organization, they've got yet another year before that can happen anyway. So the world has time to adjust to the United States not being involved in those types of things. But most of all, the litigation that he's inviting with this, and that those that help put those executive orders are provoking and eager to see play out, mean that it could be months, if not years, before some of these executive actions are ever enforced, or months or years before they're completely canceled out by courts.
I want to bring in Torian Small from Capitol Hill, because today, this afternoon, an affidavit was presented to the Senate Armed Services Committee regarding someone with information that she believed was pertinent to the pending confirmation of Pete Hegseth as this nation's next defense secretary. Torian, please let us know what you've learned.
Yeah, Major, that someone is Danielle Hegseth. That's the former wife of Pete Hegseth's brother. So this in-law coming forward with this information that she's purporting to be pretty damaging. She, in this affidavit, laid out instances of her perceived or perception of abuse from him to his wife at the time, Samantha Hegseth, and also instances of public drunkenness. She said in this, during the period of 2014 to 2016, she experienced some pretty significant incidents, or was told about some significant incidents from her sister, his then wife, now ex-wife. Throughout this affidavit, she laid out exactly why she didn't believe that he is best fit for this. And she said she also came to the FBI to give the same statement in confidentiality. The question is, though, Major, why she's coming forward now with this information. Well, two answers to that. The first one is, again, she went back already to the FBI to lay this out. She had concerns about whether or not she could not only get a copy of her testimony, but that would be made public. The second answer is this came as a response to a request from the top Democrat on the Senate Armed Services Committee, that's Jack Reed. He had some pretty big concerns about this process moving forward and being fast-tracked by Republicans. During his confirmation hearing, Pete Hegseth's confirmation hearing, Reed said that he doesn't believe that the FBI did its due diligence and that this investigation was exhaustive in all these allegations and claims made to Hegseth. Now, I should say that Hegseth's attorney did respond to this, saying that this is essentially a disgruntled ex-family member who has an axe to grind with Hegseth and the Hegseth family. He said in part, quote, that Danielle is a far-left anti-Trump Democrat who is divorced from Mr. Hegseth's brother. So again, he's maintaining that he did not do any of these things that she's claiming, and is maintaining his innocence against any accusations of misconduct or abuse.
Torian Small on Capitol Hill, thank you for that important update. Appreciate it. President Trump meets with Republican leaders at the White House. What the focus will be when it comes to his legislative agenda, we'll get our reporter panel's insight on that next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Government leaders and business leaders from around the globe are currently gathering in Davos, Switzerland for the World Economic Forum's annual multi-day meeting. What world leaders are sure to discuss this week, newly inaugurated President Trump beginning his second term. Ravi Agrawal is in Davos covering the World Economic Forum meeting. He's doing so because he's an editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine. Ravi, good to see you. Always a pleasure. Any talk so far about Trump 2.0 beginning yesterday, going into his second day?
Any talk? I mean, it's all the talk. I think it's rare that Davos is overshadowed by something else other than what's going on here. And this is certainly one year where a lot of the attention is actually on Washington, D.C. As Trump was speaking, as he was taking the oath of office yesterday, a lot of people, I was around, CEOs, leaders, were anxiously checking in, looking at clips, trying to get a sense of, what he might focus on. Obviously, here in Davos in Switzerland, there are a lot of European leaders in attendance. They're very worried about tariffs. There are leaders from other parts of the world who have, other concerns about Trump's global agenda. Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is here as well, also closely watching how Trump might change America's Ukraine policy. But really, in many ways, people are watching with bated breath to see if Trump's bite is going to be as bad in some senses as his bark on a lot of issues they care about.
And Ravi, to what degree is the conversation touching on things like what President Trump has said about Greenland or about the Panama Canal, or something that seems fanciful here but may not be read as fanciful in Davos, renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America?
So I think a lot of people now, the types of people who come here, they've learned to take Trump seriously. They want to be ready. So they have come out with strong statements, for example, on his comments about Greenland. Similarly, the Canadians have come out with very strong statements. Krista Freeland, the former finance minister, wrote a great piece in the Washington Post about why Canada should oppose it and how Canada could make other friends if it needed to. So there's a lot of deterrence in that people know that Trump often trial balloons ideas. Sometimes his statements are negotiating tactics. I will say, though, that one thing that has changed from now, between now and, say, 2017, is that a lot of leaders around the world have cottoned on to what works with Trump. Whether it's flattery, whether it is a sense that if he is transactional, then they too can be transactional in response to try to appeal to his quid pro quo nature or his smell for a deal. They've understood that. They've understood also that, if you want to get in with Trump world, you could try to appeal to family members. They see Trump world as being run like a family business, which is not uncommon in many parts of the world. So people are cottoning on to how to deal with Trump. Now, of course, he's mercurial, so he may know that and react in kind.
Ravi, the politics of our current time, not just in America, but in Europe and other parts of the world, disdain, if not disregard, the international institutions built after the end of World War II and all the way through the Cold War. And there have been editorial cartoons and op-eds written about basically Russia, China, and the United States carving up the world to their own selfish self-interest. Is that a topic there?
It is, and I'll tell you why. For the last 3-4 decades, there was a term called Davos man, which became very popular, and that term was coined by Samuel Huntington, who founded the magazine I now work for, Foreign Policy. And Davos man was meant to depict, sort of a caricature of a global elitist who comes here to Davos, is, in a very global fashion, thinks that boundaries don't matter, that national loyalty doesn't matter. And that was very much, the typical Davos attendee who believed in more globalization, more free trade, more coming together, that would solve all problems. And it's very clear now that a strain of, leaders around the world feel that failed. It didn't work out. More globalization didn't fix every single problem. And the answer then is protectionism, nationalism, populism, the forces that Trump is now known for, but so are many other leaders around the world. In Europe, Viktor Orban in Hungary, for example, Milei in Argentina, many others. And that kind of spells, to a degree, the end of the original Davos man, which a lot of people here are concerned about. However, Major, if you look at how closely CEOs have seemed to align themselves to Trump, not only in the last couple of months, but also just yesterday at the inauguration, then there is a clear sense that maybe business leaders are out to do business and they will do what it takes to get good deals for themselves, whether it means, a knee-jerk reaction to anything from DEI to borders or free trade. They will go with the flow. That's where we are now.
Would you say, based on conversations there in Davos, Ravi, that there is an anticipation 12 months from now, the next time Davos convenes, there will be something approximating a full-blown global trade war fought largely through tariffs?
Possibly. I think it is a major risk factor that a lot of CEOs cite. They are very worried about their supply chains. Remember, a lot of the CEOs here run big global firms. So their supply chains are mired in every country. They get components and components of components from a dizzying array of places. And they worry a lot about tariffs and the impact that could have on their bottom lines. That said, CEOs are aware as well that Trump is remarkably sensitive to the markets. He wants to see the stock markets do well. He wants to be liked and admired by the business community. And so inasmuch as CEOs here at Davos are very aware that Trump has a dramatic impact on them, they also realize that they have a lever that they could exercise over him. They can lobby, and the markets matter to this White House. So it'll be very interesting to see in the tussle between business and government, between money and power, who ends up winning out.
Ravi Agrawal, Editor-in-Chief, Foreign Policy Magazine. Always a pleasure, sir. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
We will have more news ahead. You are streaming America Decides.
Today, I will also declare a national energy emergency. We will drill, baby, drill.
In his first day in office, President Trump signed numerous executive orders promoting fossil fuels and ending many of the Biden administration efforts to combat or at least address climate change. I want to bring in CBS News environmental correspondent David Schechter. David, describe the most important actions President Trump has taken in this space.
Well, Major, I think what the president has done is bureaucratic, right? So the biggest thing that you would see here is not law, changing law, but telling the particular agencies to get going with permitting for drilling for natural gas and developing fossil fuels. So I think that's, we'll see that in small pieces, and maybe we won't even be completely obvious to us. But to say have the EPA, clear the way against some, permits to make it easier to get drilling for natural gas. But I do think there is an element that we probably would happen first. There was this moratorium that he put in now for putting in wind power, offshore wind power on the coast of the United States. The federal government controls the waters out there. And so of all the things that he did, it's potentially the easiest one to begin to say, we're not going to permit offshore wind in the United States anymore, and in fact make it difficult for those places that have already been permitted or have been permitted and are now waiting to be built.
And the president likes to tell stories about wind power, that it's the most expensive, he says, of all the energies, that it somehow is harmful to whales, and that much of the equipment is in some sort of disrepair or rotting somewhere. The president tells a lot of impressionistic, anecdotal stories. How much of any of that is true?
Well, hard to nail down any specific comment there, but first of all, wind power is very efficient. It does get subsidies from the government, just like all forms of energy do. Sometimes I've heard him talk about bird strikes and wind farms killing birds. In fact, the truth is like cats in people's backyards kill way more birds than wind farms do. So in terms of their environmental impact, being concerned that I guess the overall picture is being concerned that they are impacting the environment, they're a net positive, not a net negative. Yes, there are drawbacks to any form of energy that you would put in, but if your goal is renewable energy and a cleaner planet and less climate change, then wind is a big winner.
And one of the things that I understand happened in these executive orders was to open up exploration for oil and natural gas offshore. Now, plenty of Republican governors, Ron DeSantis in Florida, Glenn Youngkin in Virginia, just to name two, have constituents who don't want to see offshore drilling in Florida or Virginia. Is that something that, even though it's now going to be more permissible because of these executive actions, we're actually going to see?
I think it's an interesting time because, first of all, it's unclear. So President Biden, former President Biden, said we're not going to do any more of this drilling in the large swaths of our coast. And the law that he was working underneath did not necessarily provide a mechanism for the next president to undo that. So I think you'll see a lot of legal action around a decision like that in particular. When it comes to drilling and when it comes to leases for drilling, these can be held up for a long time in court and through regulations. And so I think any immediate action there seems unlikely, but the politics of it are fascinating because it doesn't really cut exactly down party lines.
David Schechter, always a pleasure. Thank you, sir. That does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.